Hey guys, tonight we begin a quiet little stroll through the ancient world. Nothing dramatic, nothing urgent, just the soft hum of history doing what history always does, which is to exist, to drift. So whatever you're doing, whether you're getting into bed, curling under a blanket, or pretending to work while your brain slowly shuts down for the day, you are in the right place. Tonight, we're going to talk about Roman slaves, their daily routines, their jobs, their quiet misery, and the gentle ways in which they kept the entire Roman world functioning while never making it into the heroic parts of Hollywood films. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Good. Now let's dim the mental lights and let the story unfold at the pace of an elderly tortoise. The first thing to understand about Roman slavery is how deeply normal it was. Rome did not merely have slaves, Rome was built out of slavery, in the same way modern cities are built out of concrete. Everything sat on top of it. The roads, the farms, the households, the armies, the administration, the parties, the baths, even the temples. If it involved sweeping, carrying, organizing, scrubbing, lifting barking orders, or being quietly miserable, there was probably a slave attached to it. Movies like to pretend that slavery in Rome was mostly a gladiator thing. Big, sweaty men with unfortunate haircuts fighting lions while the emperor lounges and eats grapes. Gladiators existed, of course. The Romans loved entertainment. They loved spectacle. They also loved blood in that strangely detached way that wealthy societies sometimes do when they run out of interesting hobbies. But gladiators were a small and relatively unusual subset of slaves. The vast majority were not dying dramatically in arenas. They were folding laundry. They were preparing cheese. They were making sure someone's sandals didn't snap in public, which was a genuine crisis in Rome, because sandals were social currency and blisters were for peasants. Let's settle quietly into a Roman household for a moment. Imagine a domus, a respectable home in the city, owned by someone who likes to believe they are important. Maybe a senator, maybe a merchant who has become wealthy enough to pretend that his grandfather wasn't still milking goats in the countryside. In these homes, slaves woke up before sunrise. They didn't leap out of bed. They didn't stretch dramatically. They didn't have coffee, because coffee had not yet been invented, and the Romans would have absolutely weaponized it if they had known about it. They simply rose, quietly, and began preparing the household for the day. Breakfast in Rome was not a culinary adventure, it was functional, comically so. A piece of bread, a little cheese, maybe some fruit, maybe leftovers from the night before. It was food with as little personality as possible, assembled by servants who knew better than to experiment. Roman cuisine could be innovative, but breakfast was a sacred space of boredom. Anything too flavorful that early in the morning would have counted as suspicious behavior. After breakfast came dressing. Roman clothing looked simple on museum mannequins, white togas, draped tunics, clean lines. But that simplicity is a lie. Togas were enormous, heavy, stubborn. They refused to drape politely and had a tendency to unfold at the worst possible moments, which is why wealthy Roman men had slaves whose entire job was to put the toga on them in the morning, adjust it throughout the day, and prevent wardrobe failure during senatorial speeches. Clothing malfunctions in the Senate were not encouraged. Rome liked its dignity, even if that dignity was being physically maintained by 3 exhausted slaves armed with safety pins and pure willpower. Another group of slaves handled the children. Roman aristocrats loved children conceptually, but preferred not to interact with them in practice. Children were delightful when well-behaved and educated, but they had the inconvenient habit of being neither. So nursemaids and pedagogues handled the day-to-day child rearing. They taught manners, reading, writing. They taught the boys Latin rhetoric, so that one day they could join the Senate and loudly complain about grain shortages and the moral decay of youth. They taught the girls domestic skills, so that they could eventually become wives, mothers, and occasional political chess pieces. Everyone had a role, even the children. While all of this domestic chaos unfolded,
A different kind of slave began organizing the logistics of the household. These were the stewards, the managers, the accountants. They handled supplies, they handled money, they handled schedules. They made sure laundry workers didn't accidentally mix dyes and create fashion disasters that would embarrass the family at public events. These managers could wield surprising influence, sometimes more influence than free citizens. The Romans had a talent for contradiction. They could give a slave immense power inside a household while denying them the legal status of a person. Pragmatism at its finest. Now let's drift away from the city and into the countryside. The Romans did not survive on imported snacks and political rhetoric. They needed food, a lot of it. Grain, olives, grapes, vegetables, meat, and the occasional delicacy like peacock, which was consumed not because it tasted good, but because rich people throughout history have always enjoyed eating things that make everyone else at the table uncomfortable. Producing all of this food required large estates called latifundia. Think early agribusiness with sandals and the looming threat of corporal punishment. These estates were worked by teams of slaves who labored from dawn to dusk, doing the sort of manual agricultural tasks that never make it into movies, because watching someone weed a field for 8 straight hours does not test well with audiences. The rhythm here was steady: plowing, sowing, irrigating, tending livestock, harvesting, crushing olives for oil, pressing grapes for wine, repairing tools, fixing barns, tracking produce, all of it supervised by overseers who specialized in being stern, sunburned, and consistently unimpressed with other people's suffering. There was no romance in this work, no dramatic speeches, just repetitive labor, mild dehydration, and the constant hum of insects. Even the scenery refused to cooperate with Hollywood. The Italian countryside is beautiful today, but ancient agriculture was messy, manure everywhere, broken tools, mud, dust, chickens, more manure. It was not an aesthetic experience, it was simply necessary. While agricultural slaves performed the noble task of feeding the empire, industrial slaves worked in mines, quarries, and workshops. Mines were particularly miserable. Deep shafts, poor air, constant danger. It was slow death delivered in occupational form. The Romans pulled metals out of the earth with the philosophical calm of a society that had absolutely no intention of going back to a barter economy. Silver, gold, copper, iron, lead, especially lead. The Romans loved lead in a way that would make modern health officials break out in hives. Lead in pipes, lead in cookware, lead in cosmetics, lead in medicine, lead as a seasoning, not officially but effectively. It was everywhere, and no one seemed particularly concerned that half the aristocracy was slowly poisoning themselves. Sometimes progress is unkind. Let's float gently back into the city, because urban slavery was not limited to households. Cities required endless labor, cleaning streets, operating public baths, emptying chamber pots, maintaining aqueducts, staffing markets, baking bread in communal ovens, heating the hypocast under the baths so that the wealthy could enjoy warm water while complaining about politics. Every corner of civic life had slaves quietly making it function. Baths in particular were complicated. The Romans treated bathing as a core social activity. They didn't meditate, they didn't journal, they bathed. They discussed business, they gossiped, they schemed, they compared physiques with casual arrogance. And all of this required an entire infrastructure of heating, scrubbing, oiling, and laundering performed by slaves who never got to enjoy the luxurious part of the bath experience. They operated the machinery of relaxation without participating in it, which is historically ironic, but unsurprising. Now let's drift gently into another category: entertainment. Rome was sickeningly fond of entertainment. Plays, races, fights, exotic animals, music. Chariot races in particular were the ancient equivalent of professional sports, with the added benefit of occasional near-death experiences. Slaves were involved at every level. They groomed horses, prepared costumes, moved scenery, cleaned up after elephants. Most people never think about who's responsible for cleaning elephant waste out of an arena between acts. In Rome, the answer was always slaves. Returning to the household for a moment, we can glide into the world of personal servants. Some slaves were hairdressers. The Romans cared about hairstyles with the same intensity modern celebrities reserve for skincare routines. Curls, waves, oils, pins, wigs. There was an entire industry dedicated to pretending that one had woken up looking perfectly arranged after spending 2 hours the night before being physically sculpted by tired slaves armed with combs and animal fat. Another group served as scribes. They copied letters, they copied books, they wrote down speeches filled with rhetorical flourishes and heavy breathing about virtue, discipline, and the decay of modern youth. Every generation believes it has discovered the collapse of civilization. The Romans simply wrote it down more beautifully.
Some slaves were tutors, others were secretaries. Some operated shops for their masters. A few even earned money, which they could sometimes save to buy their freedom. It was one of those uniquely Roman contradictions. A person could be property, but that property could own money, and that money could eventually purchase the person holding it. Rome enjoyed bending logic until it snapped, and then pretending it had always been that way. Let's float into the topic of punishment, quietly and without much enthusiasm, because Roman slavery was not a gentle institution. Punishment existed, beatings existed, branding existed. Running away was a dangerous hobby that rarely ended well, but movies exaggerate the violence and ignore the monotony. The real punishment was repetition, folding the same garment, grinding the same grain, carrying the same amphorae, listening to the same aristocratic complaints about how difficult life is when your mosaic artist refuses to capture the correct angle of your heroic profile. It was slow, grinding, existential erosion, not the cinematic kind, the boring kind. Despite all this, some slaves gained status, especially educated Greeks taken during wars. The Romans admired Greek culture with the same intensity that they conquered it. They wanted Greek teachers, Greek philosophers, Greek doctors, Greek sculptors, Greek everything. So Greek slaves sometimes found themselves living surprisingly comfortable lives, not glamorous, but cushioned by the fact that Romans were more willing to physically punish a field worker than someone explaining Plato to the children. To understand the scale of slavery, we can drift briefly into population. At Rome's height, as much as a third of the population of Italy may have been enslaved. In Sicily, even more. It was woven into everything. No one imagined a world without it, because imagining alternatives is a luxury societies rarely grant themselves. Freedom is easier to dream about when you already have it. And that brings us to the quiet irony at the center of Roman slavery. The empire built its roads, its aqueducts, its ports, its estates, and its glittering public monuments on the assumption that labor did not need to be compensated beyond food and survival. Wealth trickled upward, hardship trickled downward, and the entire structure balanced just finely enough to last for centuries. Let's drift gently into the evening. The Roman household wound down slowly. Lamps were lit. Dinner was served. Dinner was the main meal, larger, more performative. Wealthy Romans reclined on couches and ate while slaves circulated with trays of food that grew increasingly elaborate as social status increased. Exotic sauces, spiced meats, imported fruits, more wine than medically advisable. Conversation became the entertainment, arguments, philosophy, poetry, gossip, and always the quiet presence of servants refilling cups, replacing plates, and pretending not to hear anything they were not supposed to hear. After dinner came cleanup, washing dishes, scraping floors, managing leftovers, extinguishing lamps, locking doors, and preparing for the next day of repetitive labor in a world that had no concept of weekends, paid leave, or mental health breaks. The idea of burnout existed,
but only as exhaustion, not as a social problem worth discussing. And so a Roman slave slept, lightly, often in small rooms, sometimes in corridors, sometimes next to the kitchen, sometimes in sheds. And when dawn returned, the entire cycle began again, quietly, indifferently, without fanfare. And that is where we will leave them for now, because tomorrow will look exactly the same. Rome was like that. The drama belonged to the elite. The routine belonged to everyone else.
Morning drifts back into Rome like a somewhat bored house cat. The sunlight climbs over tiled roofs, through courtyard columns, and across dusty pavements that have seen more sandal traffic than any sidewalk deserves. And again, before the free members of the household even contemplate opening their eyes, the slaves are already awake. Rome never fully sleeps, but its enslaved workforce simply rests briefly until labor politely insists they stand up again. The morning tasks are predictable to the point of existential comedy. The kitchen slaves begin preparing breakfast with the gentle resignation of people who know they are about to feed someone who will complain anyway. Bread is checked, cheese is sliced, wine is diluted. Children are woken, scrubbed, and dressed with varying degrees of cooperation. The toddler screams, the older child sulks, the teenager pretends to be philosophical about it, the nursemaid pretends to care. The master of the house eventually emerges and pretends not to notice that the entire household has been functioning for hours without him. He is already draped neatly in his toga by the domestic staff, who have become experts in the physics of Roman fashion. He eats, he instructs, he leaves, usually to lounge somewhere in public pretending to govern or pretending to dislike the government, often both at the same time. Aristocrats had a talent for complaining about things they actively benefited from. It was a cultural sport. Once breakfast ends, the household divides again. The city slaves go out in small groups to gather supplies from the markets. Romans did not have refrigerators. Food needed to be bought constantly. Fresh produce, bread, fish, meat, spices, oil, more oil, even more oil. Roman cuisine was the Mediterranean way of saying, yes, everything is better when dripping and slightly slippery. Market slaves carried baskets and jugs through the bustling noise. Vendors shouted prices. Animals wandered casually through the crowd without any awareness that they were technically inventory. And the slaves navigated this mild chaos with the same passive competence that keeps modern grocery stores functioning at 5 p.m. on a weekday. Meanwhile, the indoor staff cleaned. Cleaning in Rome was endless. Dust accumulated on everything with a dedication that bordered on heroic. Floors needed sweeping, walls needed wiping, statues needed polishing, because nothing ruins a respectable Roman home faster than a marble bust covered in fingerprints. The Romans did not have vacuums. They did not have disinfectant sprays. They had slaves with rags, brooms, and decent upper body strength. Now we can drift quietly into an aspect of Roman slavery that movies rarely mention: literacy. A surprising number of slaves could read and write, especially Greeks. The Romans admired Greek intellect the way modern people admire Scandinavian furniture design, with envy, with desire, and with the unavoidable shadow of conquest. Educated slaves served as scribes. They copied documents, they wrote letters, they drafted contracts, they kept accounts. They also produced literature, because nothing says cultural sophistication like having someone else create art for you while you loudly claim patronage credit. It is time to float gently toward the Roman legal world, because it shaped slavery in ways that feel deeply alien to modern sensibilities. Legally, a slave was property, not a person. But Roman law loved exceptions. It collected exceptions like modern collectors gather expensive sneakers. A slave could not marry in the legal sense, but slaves did form relationships. They lived as couples, they raised children, and sometimes those children were freed alongside their parents. Because in Rome, status was both rigid and negotiable, depending entirely on whether someone wealthy found it convenient. Freedom could be purchased. It could also be granted.
Masters freed slaves for loyalty, for competence, occasionally for affection, sometimes to improve their own public image. Nothing said, "I am a benevolent Roman citizen," like freeing a slave during a festival while having the entire neighborhood witness your moral superiority. Freed slaves became freedmen. Not entirely free in the modern sense, they owed obligations. Patronage. Patronage was Rome's quiet glue. Freedmen could accumulate wealth, they could operate businesses, they could even become influential. It was a strange arrangement where someone who spent half a lifetime as property could end up richer than a poor citizen from the countryside who had never been enslaved a day in his life. Rome enjoyed playing fast and loose with merit, status, and economic irony. Let's glide now into the world of workshops. Many Roman slaves worked in trades: blacksmithing, pottery, metalwork, woodwork, textile production. These were not glamorous professions, but they produced everything that kept Rome visually recognizable: pots for cooking, lamps for lighting, furniture for reclining, tools for building. There is a reason Roman ruins are full of bricks stamped with manufacturers' marks. Ancient branding existed, it simply lacked modern marketing slogans. Workshops produced the uniforms, harnesses, and wheels that made the legions possible. They produced amphora that held grain, wine, olive oil, and the miscellaneous liquids that made long-distance trade financially worthwhile. They produced nails by the million. The humble nail is possibly the most underappreciated achievement of human civilization. Without it, nothing stays assembled. Without slavery, Rome would have had to pay someone to produce nails, which was clearly unacceptable to the Roman elite. We drift now toward the ports. Rome's maritime world was vast and deeply unromantic. Ports were loud. Ships were unloaded by slaves carrying cargo up and down ramps with the stoic monotony of people whose job description never changed. Grain ships from Egypt, wine from Greece, timber from the Alps, fish sauce from everywhere. Fish sauce was the Roman ketchup. Everyone used it, even when they probably shouldn't have. Slave porters worked through the noise, the smell, and the unceasing tide of imports that fed Rome's urban appetite. Now let us pause briefly in front of something most modern minds overlook: time. Roman slaves did not measure time the way we do. Hours were seasonal, shorter in winter, longer in summer. There were no mechanical clocks. Work was tied to light and necessity. It drifted, it flowed, it expanded to fill whatever space the household demanded. Weekends did not exist. Vacations did not exist. Leisure was a class privilege. The wealthy rested, the poor labored, the enslaved labored more. Let's float quietly into midday. The city heats up. People retreat indoors. Meals are taken. Afternoon tasks begin. The household cooks prepare dinner slowly because Roman dinners were a social performance. Wealthy Romans reclined across low couches arranged around a table. They ate in courses. They discussed philosophy. They complained about foreigners while using Greek tutors to raise their children. Hypocrisy was the Roman national pastime. During these meals, slaves served quietly. They poured wine. They fetched dishes. They cleared platters. They refilled lamp oil. They hovered on the edges of conversations that revealed the inner workings of political alliances, business ventures, marriages arranged for convenience, and feuds that had been simmering since someone insulted someone else's nephew at a festival 3 years prior. Slaves heard everything. They were the ancient world's unofficial data storage system. Rome survived partly on gossip, and slaves were the silent custodians of that information. After dinner ended, the household slowed again. Lamps were extinguished, doors were barred. The master retreated to the tablinum to read or pretend to read, while actually thinking about business matters. The mistress evaluated household expenses or examined textiles or supervised the serving staff. The children were coerced into sleep, and the slaves completed their final tasks before settling into brief rest. But not all slaves lived in households or fields or workshops. Some existed in far more specialized niches that modern people rarely imagine. Public slave labor existed. Cities owned slaves. The state owned slaves. temples owned slaves. They served as clerks, guards, janitors, archivists, custodians, diggers, engravers, and occasionally sacred assistants. Temples, in particular, enjoyed having ceremonial attendants who performed rituals without ever joining the priesthood. Religion was not egalitarian, it was structured, hierarchical, and administratively exhausting. Now we can drift into the world of personal attendants to the Roman elite. Wealthy Romans traveled frequently, villas in the countryside, trips to the baths at Baiae, vacations to seaside estates where the main activity was complaining about the heat and conspicuously displaying wealth to other wealthy people. These trips required logistical support: carts, pack animals, food, bedding, clothing. Slaves handled all of it. They carried items, loaded wagons, set up accommodations, cooked meals in unfamiliar environments, managed schedules, and served as the quiet infrastructure of elite leisure. It is time to float gently into death, not a dramatic death, just the administrative side of mortality. When wealthy Romans died, their estates had to be inventoried, debts recorded, property distributed, tombs prepared, funerary arrangements conducted. Slaves handled documents, cleaned tomb goods, prepared offerings, dressed bodies, and managed the funeral banquets where mourners pretended to grieve while counting potential inheritances. Even in death, Roman aristocrats remained committed to spectacle, and slaves remained committed to logistics. At this point, we may drift toward the topic of slave rebellions, not to dramatize them, not to linger on battle, simply to acknowledge that resistance existed because human beings dislike being treated as objects. The most famous rebellion was led by Spartacus, a gladiator, a Thracian, a man who clearly understood that the Roman system was stacked in favor of everyone except himself. His rebellion terrified the Roman elite, not because they feared defeat, but because they feared inconvenience. Life was difficult enough without tens of thousands of slaves refusing to accept the monotony of assigned labor. But rebellions remained rare, not because slaves lacked spirit, but because Rome's system was too large, too organized, too willing to punish collective disobedience. Most slaves resisted in smaller ways: slowing work, breaking tools, hiding supplies, small acts of survival that rarely appear in written histories because Roman historians, predictably, were not interested. Now let's drift gently through economy. Slavery shaped Roman prices, it shaped production, it shaped markets. Cheap labor allowed grand urban construction, monumental architecture, baths, roads, temples, aqueducts. Without slavery, Rome would have been smaller, poorer, less opulent. The elite would have had to work, and that was clearly unacceptable. Work was conceptually admirable, but practically frowned upon by those who enjoyed soft couches and free time. We can now settle into a corner of Roman cultural psychology. Romans admired discipline, virtue, labor, but only abstractly. Physical labor was considered necessary but socially demeaning. Citizens might farm, citizens might manage, but citizens were not supposed to haul bricks or scrub floors. That was delegated downward. And so slavery filled the gap between moral philosophy and physical reality. Rome talked like a republic of hard-working citizens. It behaved like an aristocratic leisure machine built on enforced labor. As evening returns, we can examine the concept of hope. Slaves lived within a system that dangled the possibility of manumission, freedom, legal status, social mobility. Not guaranteed, not common, but possible. And possibility is often enough to keep a system running quietly. Many slaves saved wages from skilled labor, many accumulated funds, many purchased their own freedom, and many, once freed, continued to work for their former masters in a new legal capacity. Patronage endured, obligation endured. The Roman world was a web of invisible threads that kept everyone slightly indebted to someone else. Before we close this part, we should sink briefly into the subject of storytelling. Ancient historians barely wrote about slaves. They wrote about generals, emperors, senators, wars, elections, festivals, reforms. The enslaved majority lived in the margins. Their stories were not considered worthy of literature, but they were the ones who cooked meals, built temples, harvested grain, mined silver, staffed baths, groomed horses, copied texts, raised children, managed estates, carried water, scrubbed floors, milled grain, and supported the entire structure while remaining almost entirely invisible. And so, when we talk about Rome, we inevitably talk about the free few rather than the enslaved many. But it was the many who made Rome feel like an empire rather than an idea. Without them, the streets would be dirty, the aqueducts would be clogged, the forums would be silent, the baths would be cold, the villas would be empty, the ships would be still, and the aristocracy would be forced to experience the debilitating horror of manual labor. That would have been deeply inconvenient, and Romans preferred convenience.
Hey again. If you're still awake, that means the gentle horrors of ancient labor relations are doing their job. Perfect. So let's drift back into the Roman streets and households, where slavery was not some marginal institution, but the machinery that kept life humming along, quietly, ruthlessly, and with much less cinematic drama than Hollywood would prefer. At this point in the night, we begin to settle into the repetitive rhythms of normal days, and the Roman day was deeply repetitive. It was defined by the sun, the chores, and the mild despair of being property. The legal term wasn't subtle either. A slave was res, meaning a thing. Roman law did not do sentimentality. Many domestic slaves woke before dawn. Households liked to appear effortless, as though the family simply rolled out of bed into a world that had already been scrubbed, warmed, and perfumed. That required people who were invisible by design. A modern viewer may imagine torches and shouting. In reality, it was more like quiet shuffling, hushed instructions, and a constant evaluation of what might irritate the mistress of the house today. Kitchen staff often started first. Bread needed to be prepared. The ovens were hot and temperamental. Kneading dough was not glamorous, nor was it optional. The Romans consumed alarming quantities of bread. Wheat was political. Grain supply riots were a normal civic hobby, so someone had to ensure dough existed. That someone was rarely free. Nearby, the household valets and attendants were dealing with lamps. Oil lamps blackened everything. Wicks needed trimming. Oil needed topping. Trying to get soot off walls was an ongoing exercise in disappointment. Slaves did it anyway, because nobody else would. Bathing equipment was also prepped early. Wealthier homes had internal bath suites, most did not, but even modest wealthy homes might keep warm water ready for morning washing. Firewood and charcoal were hauled in, water was heated, and basins laid out. If that sounds relaxing, it was not. Roman baths were cozy for patrons and hellish for staff. Temperature control involved constant feeding of furnaces. Imagine being a living thermostat with zero rights, holding burning tiles against pipes while your master complained that the tepidarium was slightly too tepid. As we stroll through the morning, we meet the pedagogues. These were slaves assigned to supervise children. They were essential members of high-status households. A noble Roman child could not just be left alone to wander around poking lizards with sticks. The family had hopes, ambitions, political futures. Tutors taught, pedagogues monitored, scribes copied, and no one asked the child if they wanted any of this. Childhood was brief, expectations were not. The pedagogue ensured the boy didn't humiliate himself in public. He also ensured that the boy's father didn't murder him for failing to memorize Cicero. Roman family life was a delicate ecosystem. Let's drift a bit into textile work. Laundry in Rome was bizarrely industrial and equally bizarrely enabled by urine. Yes, the Roman world was fueled by other people's bodily fluids. Fuller workshops collected urine to use as a cleaning agent. It contained ammonia, which stripped stains and whitened fabric. Slaves did the stomping. They stood in tubs of urine-soaked fabrics and agitated them with their feet. Repetitive, unpleasant, aromatic, not remotely the glamorous toga life shown in films. Back in the home, the ornatrices prepared the mistress's hair. Roman elite hairstyles were feats of engineering. Curls, rolls, towers, braids,
Wireframes, false hair, and imported pieces from captured peoples all contributed to an aesthetic described by one historian as architectural optimism. The slave hairdressers endured constant critique. If a curl fell out, the mistress blamed them. If her scalp hurt, the mistress blamed them. If her husband looked indifferent, the mistress definitely blamed them. Every society eventually makes women angry about hair. Rome simply weaponized it. From here, we drift into the midday zone. Clients arrived for business. Masters entertained. Public life happened. Domestic slaves moved in intentional silence. They poured wine. They fetched water. They kept flies away with fans. They observed, without reacting, because reacting was not permitted. One modern historian remarked that a Roman household was a performance with an invisible crew. The crew just happened to be legally owned. The afternoon took slaves outside. Errands were constant. Markets needed visiting. Deliveries needed retrieving. Letters needed carrying. Rome did not have uniform mail service for private citizens. Messages traveled by slave feet. There was no privacy either. If you wanted to tell your friend that your brother-in-law was irritating, a slave carried that information and almost certainly noted the gossip for future leverage. Some domestic slaves had remarkably specialized tasks. The cubesor helped the master with shoes. The unguentarius mixed perfumes. The structor arranged dining couches for guests. The tricliniarchus oversaw banquet layout. The pincerna poured wine. And yes, Rome had a slave specifically assigned to stand behind guests and remind them to restrain gluttony. Roman banquets were not subtle. But restaurants, not really. The average Roman home did not cook much. Most people ate out in taverns or bought street food. Slaves handled the transactions. They fetched hot meals. They dealt with vendors. They had spending authority, but the money wasn't theirs. Financial autonomy without ownership was a theme in Roman slavery. Let's slowly shift toward field labor, because if domestic slavery involved humiliation and exhaustion, field labor involved endurance. Italy's farmland was worked by large teams. They planted, weeded, harvested, and threshed. Wine estates had their own rhythm. Harvest season was frantic. Amphorae needed filling. Presses needed operating. Grapes did not wait. Neither did olive season. The olive presses were unforgiving. Slaves worked until the crop was processed. Cutting corners meant losing profit. Losing profit meant punishment. Movie depictions often show overseers shouting dramatically. Reality was quieter. Orders were clear, expectations punishment, and resistance pointless. Slaves were expensive assets. Killing them for sport made no economic sense. Psychological pressure and calculated deterrence were cheaper and more scalable. Rome essentially industrialized intimidation.
As the sun dipped, some slaves transitioned into evening duties. Lamps were lit again, cushions arranged, meals prepared, guests entertained. Romans preferred reclining while eating. This made serving complex. Wine dilution ratios mattered. Most Romans did not drink wine straight. Water was added based on status, taste, and whether anyone cared about hangovers. Domestic slaves observed the social hierarchies of others while existing at the absolute bottom themselves. There was irony in watching men debate philosophy while ignoring the human being pouring their cup. Rome was fond of irony. It rarely acknowledged it. If we float over to the urban shops, we find slaves operating businesses. Some were bakers, some were barbers, some ran full commercial workshops producing shoes, tools, rugs, metal goods, and pottery. The profits went to the master, not the workers. With enough trust, some slaves managed money. They handled accounts. They negotiated prices. They managed inventories. A few managed other slaves, forming miniature pyramids of unfree labor. Humans are very consistent about hierarchy. We should also wander into the mines again, not for excitement, but for completeness. Mining was the bleakest slice of Roman slavery. The mines were dark, cramped, damp, and unhealthy. No sunlight, no air circulation, no escape. A modern scholar joked that the mines functioned as Rome's retirement plan for unwanted humans. Not inaccurate.
life expectancy was low. Rome needed silver and copper. Human bodies were the renewable resource used to obtain them. Let's gently darken the tone and then soften again. Some slaves lived relatively stable lives. They slept indoors, they ate regularly, they interacted with the household. Others barely qualified as surviving. Rome was not uniform, it was a gradient of misery. The evening wound down with tasks reversed. Lamps snuffed, debris swept, leftovers stored, fires dampened, tools put away, doors locked, children tucked into beds they did not make, adults slipped into linens they did not launder. The household slept. The slaves did not always sleep. Night watches continued. Elders monitored the entrance. Dogs barked, babies cried. Rome hummed in the dark. Then the next day came, exactly like the last, because that was the point. Slavery was not episodic, it was monotony enforced across time. And as we settle more deeply into the world of unfree labor, we start to notice something unromantic and very un-Hollywood. Roman slavery was not action, it was not revolution, it was not Spartacus every day. It was chores, endless chores, quiet, unexciting, grinding, and constant. It was the microscopic maintenance of an empire that did not clean up after itself. In movies, the camera loves the Senate. It loves legions marching. It loves the emperor dying dramatically. But none of that functioned without the invisible population that cooked, swept, hammered, lifted, schlepped, copied, polished, trimmed, counted, and hauled. The empire's grandeur was built on people who did not own their own names. And so, as we glide toward the next stretch of our night, we'll shift into the specialty slaves who operated as artisans, bankers, educators, entertainers, and, because Rome was Rome, professional companions. Their days were different, their nights sometimes too. But for now, let's just settle here, in the twilight of the Roman workday, while the oil lamps flicker and the city finishes chewing on its daily ration of wheat, gossip, and dissatisfaction. The slaves would awaken tomorrow. They always did.
We return now to the Roman city at a gentle cruising pace. The streets have emptied a bit. The noise has settled into low murmurs. And like a very slow camera panning across ancient stone, we carelessly zoom into the world of specialized slaves. The ones who did not sweep floors or haul grain. Instead, they performed tasks that were closer to professions. And yet, they were no less property for it. Rome was excellent at monetizing skill sets it did not have to pay wages for. We begin with the scribes. They began their days surrounded by wax tablets, ink pots, and scrolls that never behaved. Wax tablets were erasable, which was convenient for drafting letters and legal notes, and inconvenient for anyone with sweaty hands. The scribe copied documents, kept accounts, recorded property holdings, tallied debts, and occasionally forged signatures when the master needed plausible deniability. Jokingly, some scholars called them the human spreadsheets of Rome. Their lives were repetitive, quiet, and strangely dignified. But dignity did not change legal status. A spreadsheet is still a spreadsheet. Other literate slaves acted as amanuenses, which meant they took dictation. Roman elites loved dictating letters. It made them feel like Cicero, even if their Latin read like a drunk forum vendor. The slaves sat silently, stylus in hand, absorbing every complaint, insult, and embarrassing political assumption. This created one of Rome's less discussed social dynamics, the slave as involuntary secret keeper. Entire family feuds were archived in their heads with no confidentiality clause. Let's float over to the medical slaves. Wealthy households liked to have their own doctors. They were often Greek, and they were usually enslaved. Ironically, the better they were at their jobs, the more indispensable they became. They treated fevers, lanced boils, set broken bones, mixed herbal concoctions, and offered dietary advice that mostly amounted to "don't eat so much salted fish." Roman elites were hypochondriacs. They blamed bad humors for everything.
Doctors humored them to maintain peace. Then there were the educators. The pedagogue we met earlier supervised children's behavior. The grammaticus taught them literature. The rhetor taught them persuasion. Rome believed children should memorize poetry and recite speeches long before they learned anything practical. It was preparation for civic life, or at least for being insufferable at dinner parties later in adulthood. These educators often experienced a strange paradox. They taught future senators, yet could not testify legally in court. Authority without rights was a Roman specialty. If we drift outside the home again, we find the artisans. They carved wood, they shaped metal, they blew glass, they stitched shoes, they dyed wool. Their days were measured by materials and orders. There was nothing heroic about it, just slow work. The dyes smelled, the tools were heavy, the ventilation non-existent. Rome did not regulate workplace safety because Rome did not have OSHA. It had "don't die if possible," which was more of a suggestion than a policy. Glassworkers heated sand until it became viscous. Then they blew and shaped it before it cooled into brittle disappointment. Metalworkers hammered bronze and iron into useful forms. The rhythm of the hammer became a kind of industrial heartbeat across the city. Slaves and freedmen often worked side by side here. The line between freedom and servitude blurred in the workshop. One had wages, the other had rations. Otherwise, not much changed. Let's float into the financial realm. Yes, Rome had slave bankers. They counted coins, managed ledgers, and even loaned money on behalf of the master. Some ran entire estates financially. Wealthy Romans preferred outsourcing the boring parts of being wealthy. So slaves collected rents, oversaw warehouses, managed inventories, and occasionally scolded tenants for late payments. Imagine being yelled at by someone who didn't legally exist as a person. Rome excelled at absurdity. The evening markets bring us toward the entertainers. This includes musicians, actors, acrobats, dancers, and comedians. Entertainment was a respected craft so long as one was free. If one was enslaved, it was merely a profitable diversion controlled by the master. Actors in particular occupied a strange social tier. They were adored publicly and despised privately. It was similar to modern celebrity culture with fewer interviews and more restraining orders. Some entertainers were hired out for dinners. They performed while guests reclined on couches, occasionally pretending to listen while consuming too much wine. Dancers flowed between tables, musicians strummed lyres, pipes, and harps. Singing happened quietly unless someone wanted to show off talent. Romans enjoyed talent as long as it belonged to someone else. If we gently redirect to another corner of the city, we encounter the household slaves responsible for hospitality. The doorkeepers, for example. The ostiarius sat by the entrance. He managed visitors. He assessed status. He filtered out uninvited relatives. Very important work in a society obsessed with honor and reputation. Behind him, the salarius managed the food storage and provisions. Rome had no refrigeration, so storage meant clay jars, cool cellars, salted goods, and trust that the slaves overseeing it would not skim too much off the top. They did anyway, because humans do. Now we drift into the world of companionship. Elite men often wanted charming, educated slaves around simply to converse. The Romans believed intellect was a luxury item. Owning educated humans was a sort of social proof. See how refined we are. We keep philosophers as pets. Some were tutors. Some recited poetry on command. Some debated stoicism over dinner. Some read scrolls aloud for the family before bed. Rome invented the audiobook, except the audiobook had opinions and no freedom. The afternoon sun begins to soften now, and with it we approach the more awkward category, the domestic companions tasked with intimacy. Rome did not separate sex from power. It rarely even pretended to. Slaves were accessible. Consent was not relevant. Scholars write about this in quiet, dispassionate language because history has no pause button for discomfort. For many slaves, intimacy was not an occupation. It was a condition of ownership. Their daily life involved managing their body as property and then waking up tomorrow to do it again. Let's slowly migrate toward the countryside again, where another specialty existed. The villicus, the estate manager, often a slave. He oversaw farming operations. He assigned tasks. He tracked yields. He punished infractions. He was the local administrator on behalf of an absentee master who preferred Rome's nightlife to agricultural logistics. The villicus lived at the intersection of power and powerlessness. He commanded people he legally belonged to, a contradiction held together by Roman practicality. As the light fades, we settle near the city fountains. Water distribution was public and fairly democratic. Slaves fetched water in clay jugs for the household. The fountains were gathering points. News spread there, gossip too. Slaves overheard everything. Rulers feared uprisings because slaves collectively knew more about the elite than the elite knew about anything. Knowledge without agency is a recurring feature of the Roman world. Night finally arrives. Tavern doors close, workshops quiet, the scribes put away the tablets, the cooks soak pots that never fully come clean, the hairdressers set down pins and combs, the doorkeepers lock bolts, the educators sigh over tomorrow's recitations, the entertainers rest their fingers and voices, the vineyard slaves collapse into straw pallets, the banking slaves secure coins in chests they could count but not spend, and the domestic servants wait for the household to fall asleep before they are allowed to. And then another morning waits just out of view, identical to the last. Consistency was the rhythm of Roman enslavement. No climaxes, no grand narratives, just repetition. Movies don't show the repetition. They prefer revolt, violence, high stakes, Spartacus with dramatic lighting and orchestral strings. They prefer the improbable exception to the rule. But most Roman slaves did not revolt. They did not flee across mountains. They did not stab their master in bathhouse steam. They carried water jugs. They balanced books. They combed hair. They copied letters. They tuned lyres. They ladled stew. They ran errands. They folded linens. They stomped laundry. They trimmed wicks. They listened to complaints. They endured the endlessness of someone else's routine. In the end, daily life for Roman slaves was profoundly uncinematic, which, ironically, makes it more real than any triumphal statue or marble inscription. Empires are not built on glory, they are built on chores.
Now we drift softly into one of the stranger aspects of Roman slavery, the part that movies politely ignore because it does not involve swords, sandals, or slow-motion speeches. It involves paperwork, it involves legal status, and it involves the idea that a slave could technically stop being a slave without ever really becoming free in the way modern people imagine. Rome loved paradoxes. They made the world feel organized. This is where we meet manumission, the act of formally releasing a slave from bondage, not out of kindness, not out of human rights, but because Romans believed efficiency extended beyond ownership. A freed slave remained loyal. They owed favors. They owed gratitude. And more importantly, they owed obligations to their former master, who conveniently became their patron. Freedom was a change of costume, not necessarily a change of condition. But before we drift too far into the legal fog, we should gently examine how someone reached that point. It begins with the thing that absorbs most of Roman daily life, the economy. Slaves generated value. They cooked meals so masters could focus on networking. They harvested olives so masters could focus on politics. They managed workshops so masters could focus on complaining about politics. When a slave proved reliable, profitable, or socially useful, the master sometimes rewarded them by allowing them to handle money, pocket money, savings, gifts, tiny economic crumbs that could accumulate over decades into something resembling a financial cushion. Some slaves bought their freedom. Others had it granted as a retirement benefit. Many had it granted in a will because Romans enjoyed looking generous when they could no longer be bothered with the aftermath.
It was the ancient version of donating to charity on one's deathbed, except the charity could talk back. Once manumitted, the slave became a freed man or freed woman. They now belonged to a new intermediate category of humanity. Not enslaved, not noble, not equal, something in between, a sort of social limbo with paperwork. They acquired a Roman name, usually the master's name. This helped reinforce the small detail that their identity came pre-attached to someone else's. Daily life changed in predictable ways. A freed man could now earn wages. He could rent property. He could marry legally. He could join a trade guild. He could attend certain public events without feeling like the furniture. What he could not do was hold major public office or pretend to be old aristocracy. The elite guarded their privileges with a level of discipline usually associated with dragons guarding gold hoards in stories that Romans would not invent for another millennium. The freedman maintained obligations to his former master, now called his patron. He performed services, he offered political support, he attended public appearances as a subtle walking endorsement. Rome was built on patronage the way modern cities are built on concrete. Everything rested on it, even if no one found it particularly glamorous. Now we glide slowly back to the daily routines, because even manumission did not erase routine. Freed men continued doing the same tasks as before. The difference was not the work, the difference was the compensation. Instead of rations, they received wages. Instead of orders, they received suggestions, which were still basically orders with slightly more etiquette attached. Some freedmen became astonishingly wealthy. Not aristocrat wealthy, not ancient oligarch wealthy, but wealthy enough to build business networks that made senators uncomfortable. Wealth without noble lineage irritated the Roman upper class the way sand irritates sandals. It was a problem, and Rome hated problems without a proper aristocratic label. This is how the phenomenon of the imperial freedmen emerged. Under the emperors, certain freedmen became indispensable administrators. They managed correspondence. They oversaw finances. They supervised supply chains for armies. They organized palace functions. They read reports from faraway governors who were always complaining about something or requesting another shipment of grain. Emperors trusted these freedmen because trust was expensive and aristocracies were unreliable. One of the most famous imperial freedmen was Narcissus, secretary to Emperor Claudius. Not the mythological Narcissus, though the comparison would have amused Romans. This Narcissus wielded immense influence by controlling access to the emperor's time. He managed information. He filtered messages. He decided which political crises deserved attention and which could be ignored until they inconveniently grew sharper teeth. Senators resented him. Of course they did. Being upstaged by someone who started life as property was not flattering to people who believed lineage was a personality trait. And yet, even at this level, daily life for freedmen remained strangely bureaucratic. It involved writing, counting, advising, negotiating delays, filing reports. Rome did not have paperclips, but if it had, imperial freedmen would have managed warehouses full of them. But before manumission came the probability of never reaching manumission. Most enslaved people in Rome lived out their lives in status without ceremony. Their days unfolded with gentle monotony. Wake early, work until midday, continue until evening, eat rations, sleep on pallets, repeat. Generations passed like this. The empire ran on that rhythm. Quiet, consistent, unremarkable labor. Historians call this the invisible majority of ancient Rome. The economy called it the workforce. Rome called it Tuesday. It is worth floating briefly through the subject of punishment, though we will do so gently, without drama or narrative spikes. Domestic punishment usually meant extra duties, denial of ration allowances, restrictions, supervised labor, or reassignment to less pleasant work. Roman masters preferred not to damage property. Efficiency trumped cruelty, at least inside the household. Outside, in estates and in mines, the tone grew darker, but we will maintain a quiet distance from those slopes because suspense is unnecessary and melodrama is not our companion tonight. Returning to the city, nighttime created a new category of labor: cleaning, scrubbing, preparing, reorganizing. The master's house needed to appear effortless by morning. Floors polished, furniture arranged, clothing mended, food prepped, lamps trimmed, even the wax tablets laid out neatly for tomorrow's dictation sessions. Night was for staging, morning was for performance. Slaves were the stagehands, masters were the actors. Rome was the theater. Everyone understood their role. Some slaves slept close to the family as living alarm clocks. Others slept in storerooms, kitchens, corridors, or shared quarters near courtyards. The beds were sacks of straw. The blankets were coarse wool. Nights were short. Dreams were irrelevant. Dawn always arrived too soon. If we drift for a moment into the baths, we find another dimension of slavery. The public baths required attendance. Someone heated the hypocast. Someone maintained the furnace. Someone scraped oil from bathers' skin with strigils. Someone sold towels. Someone guarded lockers. Someone massaged tired limbs. Someone fetched lotions made from ingredients that modern dermatologists would raise an eyebrow at. And all of it unfolded with routine calm. The baths were social centers. Cleanliness was secondary. Conversation was primary. Slaves enabled both. Let us leave the baths and move slowly through the markets again. Freedmen often became shopkeepers, bakers especially. Baking required infrastructure: ovens, grinders, delivery boys, flour, water, salt, time. Rome ran on grain. Bread was political. A shortage could cause unrest. A surplus could win elections. No emperor ever underestimated bread. Freedmen in the baking trade understood this and made fortunes selling carbs to an empire built on carbs. Their days were meticulously scheduled: knead before dawn, bake by mid-morning, sell until supplies ran out, restock, prepare dough, repeat. It was not glamorous, but it was profitable. Rome respected profitability, even if it ignored the people who generated it. As we drift toward the edges of evening again, we can gently summarize, without summarizing, that Rome's enslaved and formerly enslaved populations performed nearly every task one can assign to a functioning city. They washed, they wrote, they cooked, they counted, they brewed, they harvested, they managed, they taught, they entertained, they nursed, they constructed, they serviced, they maintained. Without them, the empire would not have felt like an empire. It would have felt like a poorly organized town with marble ambitions. Rome needed labor more than it needed philosophy, but it preferred to talk about philosophy because philosophy looked better on statues.
Now we drift out of the city again, slowly, like someone being pushed by a gentle breeze through the countryside. The buildings thin out, the road widens, and the empire begins to reveal what fed it, literally. Rome did not survive on marble porticos or philosophical treatises. It survived on agriculture: grain, olives, grapes, the holy trinity of Roman calories. And behind that trinity lay an army of people whose daily lives rarely made it into the speeches of senators. Slaves were the quiet industrial machinery of antiquity. Their workday did not end with applause. It ended with exhaustion. We begin with the latifundia again, those sprawling agricultural estates that wealthy aristocrats bought as investments. Owning land was fashionable. Owning land that produced food was even more fashionable. It allowed one to brag about harvest yields while lounging in Rome drinking imported Falernian wine. The estates required endless labor. Irrigation channels didn't clear themselves. Vines didn't prune themselves. Olive trees didn't politely drop fruit into baskets. Agriculture was the daily war of patience against nature, and Rome outsourced that war to people it did not consider citizens. The day began long before the heat. Slaves rose in the dark. They ate whatever rations they had earned, usually bread, pulses, olives, maybe cheese if fortune was generous. Water was consumed quickly.
Wine was for the master's table. Then they walked to the fields. Tools were distributed, instructions given. Overseers stood nearby to ensure nothing slowed down. Overseers were not known for warmth. They measured productivity with a rigid eye and a stick that could be raised for emphasis. The goal was not brutality, but quota. Rome was surprisingly modern in its devotion to quotas. Some slaves dug, some sowed, some harvested. Others tended livestock, sheep for wool, pigs for meat, cattle for hauling, goats for cheese. There were orchards, groves, vineyards, each with its own schedule and seasonal rhythm. The calendar governed everything. Julius Caesar reformed that calendar for a reason. Agriculture disliked chaos. Predictability was easier to manage. Let us drift toward the olive groves. Harvesting olives required skill. Few fruits demand more work for less immediate gratification. Olives are not eaten from the tree. They require curing, pressing, processing, time. Rome loved olives because olive oil was essential. It cooked their food, it lit their lamps, it moisturized their skin, it cleaned their bodies at the bathhouse. Yes, Romans washed by applying olive oil and scraping it off again. Water was for rinsing, soap was suspicious. Olive oil was therefore the ancient equivalent of the multi-tool, and producing it required relentless labor. The grapes demanded equal attention. Vineyard slaves pruned the vines through winter, tied shoots in spring, removed excess foliage in summer, and harvested clusters in autumn. Then came the pressing, feet stomping grapes in shallow vats, a slow, rhythmic, mildly sticky activity. Wine was fermented in clay amphorae, sealed with resin. The better vintages aged, the cheaper ones were consumed early. Rome consumed enormous quantities of both. Wine was considered safer than water. Water might make you sick, wine just made you philosophical. But agriculture, while exhausting, was still routine. It was visible. It was economically rational. The darker edges of Roman labor emerged elsewhere, particularly in the quarries and the mines. The empire needed stone, marble for buildings, granite for columns, limestone for mortar. It also needed metals, iron for tools, silver for currency, gold for display, copper for bronze, tin for alloying. Mining was the industrial furnace of antiquity, and slaves furnished the muscle. We descend now, calmly, into that world, without suspense, without sensationalism, just slow observation. Quarries demanded heavy lifting. Stone was cut from hillsides with iron tools. Blocks were shaped and hauled by oxen, winches, and human force. Dust filled the air. The sun was relentless. Slaves in quarries did not enjoy the soft luxuries of urban households. They did not arrange togas or read poetry aloud. They broke rocks, every day, until rocks were something else. Mining was even less cinematic. It required tunnels, shafts, galleries, and ventilation that was rarely adequate. Slaves pickaxed ore from subterranean walls. They hauled baskets of stone to the surface. They washed material in troughs to separate metal from waste. They fed furnaces that smelted ore into ingots. The work did not require skill. It required endurance, and endurance did not last forever. The mines had no retirement plan. Their daily rhythm was repetition inside darkness. Lamps flickered, tools scraped, voices echoed. Nothing changed except the pile of extracted earth. It is around this point that modern audiences might expect emotional distress or moral crescendo. But Roman history does not rise and fall with sentiment. It drifts. It normalizes. For Rome, mining was simply part of the economy, a necessary inconvenience to maintain the coinage and infrastructure of empire. Silver paid soldiers, gold decorated temples, iron built weapons and farm tools, copper produced bronze fittings and works of art. The system did not question itself. It functioned, day after day, year after year. Empire runs on inertia more than idealism. Some slaves were not owned by private citizens, but by the state. State slaves operated workshops, maintained roads, tended aqueducts, cleaned public buildings, staffed temples, operated administrative offices.
It was cheaper to maintain an enslaved bureaucracy than to hire one. Bureaucracy requires endless paperwork. Taxes need collecting, records need copying, decrees need distributing. The imperial administration realized very quickly that literacy and servitude were an efficient combination, so long as you ignored the irony. Let us move slowly toward another category of labor, the transport of goods. Rome had ports, warehouses, markets, grain ships, amphora shipments. Cargo required unloading, stacking, sorting, recording, and distributing. Slaves formed human chains at the docks. They lifted amphorae filled with wine, olive oil, garum, and grain. Amphorae were awkward. They had pointed bases. They were heavy when full. They shattered when dropped. Warehouse slaves stacked them in rows. Scribes recorded inventory. Overseers pointed at things with satisfaction. Grain shipments were the empire's bloodline. The Annona supplied Rome with grain from North Africa and Egypt. Without it, the city would starve. Bread was not a luxury. It was social stability. Slaves managed the logistics. The elite managed the speeches about how generous they were for distributing it. Public generosity was the closest thing Rome had to campaign advertising.
Now we drift quietly back toward the household again, but not to revisit chores. Instead, to examine one of Rome's stranger relationships with slavery: intimacy with status. In many elite households, slaves served as status symbols. Their clothing reflected the wealth of their owner. Their training reflected the refinement of the household. Educated Greek slaves were prized for cultured conversation. When Romans wanted to appear intellectual, they acquired Greek tutors the way modern collectors acquire art, not because they believed in education, but because education made excellent decoration. The philosopher Seneca wrote extensively about the treatment of slaves. He reminded his readers that slaves were still human. He said this not to inspire abolition, but to encourage good manners. Romans liked being moral so long as morality did not require structural change. Seneca argued that cruelty reflected poorly on the master's character. He did not question the institution itself. Reform was aesthetic rather than ideological. There was, however, one moment each year when the social hierarchy briefly tilted. During Saturnalia, a festival where masters served slaves at dinner. Roles inverted, fun was had, laughter echoed, and then, the next day, everything returned to normal. It was a controlled inversion, a symbolic holiday that acknowledged inequality without altering it. The holiday functioned like a pressure valve: release tension, maintain order. Rome understood that systems last longer when occasionally softened with theater. Let us glide, without haste, toward nighttime routines outside the household. In the countryside, when fields dimmed and tools rested, slaves gathered in small huts or shared barracks. They ate dinner in silence or quiet conversation: bread, beans, onions, maybe olives, sometimes fish if the estate bordered the sea. The meals filled the stomach rather than delighted the palate. There were no recipes, just sustenance. After eating, they slept. Sleep arrived swiftly because exhaustion demanded it, and dawn would arrive soon enough. Urban slaves experienced a different evening. Workshops closed, lamps were lit, small servings of dinner were eaten. Some slaves ran night errands, others prepared the house for morning. A few used permitted time to visit public fountains or small shrines. Household religion included slaves. They prayed to household gods for what ancient religion specializes in: survival, not transcendence. Christianity would later change that dynamic, but at this point, Rome believed in practical gods, the kind who could protect a storage jar or prevent a misfortune on the road. If we drift now into the world of law, we find that Roman jurists wrote extensively about slavery. They defined contractual obligations, property rights, manumission procedures, punishments, inheritance clauses, marriage restrictions. Slavery was not morally debated, it was administratively categorized. Legal documents discuss slaves the way modern documents discuss vehicles: ownership, transfer, liability, depreciation, maintenance. The comparison is bleak but accurate.
Rome legalized dehumanization through clarity rather than euphemism. Despite all of this structure, most Romans did not imagine slavery disappearing. It was too embedded, too economically central, too socially convenient. Philosophers speculated about human equality as a theoretical concept, but theory does not move economies. Grain shipments do, and those shipments were not loaded by free hands. Rome did not see itself as cruel, it saw itself as orderly. Cruelty required intention. Rome operated on habit. Habit is less dramatic, but far more persistent, and persistence is what defined daily life for enslaved people. The absence of climax, the absence of narrative, the endless repetition of tasks that maintained an empire.
If you're somehow still awake at this point, congratulations. You've entered the rare territory of historical stamina, which is a polite way of saying you are very committed to understanding how miserable daily life could be for people in the past. Tonight, we glide deeper into the quiet silence of Roman domestic life. More rooms, more routines, more unglamorous errands, and more subtle reminders that slavery, far from the sword-fighting blockbuster version, was often a long series of tedious tasks punctuated by occasional petty humiliations. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Now exhale, dim the lights, settle into whatever blanket fort or pillow throne you prefer. We're floating back to the city. At this point in our journey through the Roman household, we've passed through the kitchens, the gardens, the children's domain, and the personal attendants who acted as both living gadgets and emotional support furniture for their owners. But the Roman house was larger than that, not in square footage necessarily, but in social layers. Tonight, we linger on the intermediate roles, the ones between personal attendants and full estate specialists. These slaves kept the Roman home running like a slow, irritated, human-powered machine. Let's drift first into the category the Romans called the ostiarius. This was the doorman, sometimes a slave, sometimes a slightly better-off freedman. Either way, he was essentially a human ring camera system without the monthly subscription. He sat near the front entrance, he monitored who entered, he kept an eye on who knocked, he politely told unwanted guests to go away, or impolitely, depending on how highly the master valued their dignity that week. A good ostiarius needed to know faces. Roman social life revolved around status, favors, and network maintenance. If you let the wrong person in, it could create an awkward moment during dinner later. If you turned away someone who was owed a favor, you could trigger a rant that lasted days. Ancient writers mention wealthy Romans screaming at their doormen because a guest had been kept waiting in the atrium too long, which in their culture was basically a diplomatic insult. Movies present Roman elites marching into their homes with the confidence of small dictators. In reality, they were just as sensitive to social slights as any modern influencer having a slow day on social media. And the doorman slave had to manage all that energy while sitting beside the front door for hours. The job involved boredom, continuous waiting, and an intimate knowledge of who mattered, which in Rome was not always obvious. Next to the doorman came the cubicularii, the bedroom attendants. These were not glamorous roles. They oversaw linens, they changed bedding, they ensured clothes were laid out, and that none of the family members found themselves unprepared for their public duties. The Romans did not believe in closets as we do today. Clothing storage was a combination of chests, boxes, and the attentive memories of household slaves. A cubicularius who misplaced a toga on the morning of a legal case could ruin the master's week. These were also the slaves who managed the tiny details of sleep, making sure lamps were filled, curtains drawn, doors secured.
the little rituals that separated the anxiety of the public Roman world from the more controlled anxieties of private life. A surprising number of these slaves were children or adolescents. Youth was a feature, not a bug. Small hands, quick learning, and the ability to do tedious tasks for long hours without objection, because objection was not an option. From the bedrooms, we float toward the laundries because Roman hygiene was a labor-intensive group project. The phellones were the washers. Technically, many phellones were free workers, but plenty of phellones inside wealthy homes were enslaved. And the laundry process was not the romantic hillside washing scene that costume dramas occasionally give us. Roman laundry required urine, a lot of it. The ammonia in stale urine functioned as a cleaning agent, and so laundry slaves collected it, stored it, mixed it, and stomped clothing in vats of it with bare feet, then rinsed, then beat the fabric, then hung it in the sun. The final product was respectably clean by ancient standards, though the smell lingered in the imagination more than the cloth. It was not glamorous work. It lacked swords, intrigue, or Julius Caesar leaning dramatically in a cloak. It was washing, endless washing, with fluids. And if you were born into that job, it was simply what you did all day, until you grew old enough to pass it on to someone else. We now float onward to the educational sphere because Roman children did not spontaneously raise themselves on rhetoric manuals and moral maxims. Behind every well-behaved Roman boy stood a weary slave called a pedagogus. This figure walked the young master to school, stood behind him during lessons, corrected posture, disciplined behavior, managed notebooks and wax tablets, and ensured that the future citizen of Rome did not embarrass his lineage more than was statistically inevitable. Pedagogi were Greek, sometimes respected, but always enslaved. Their job resembled parenting with the volume turned down and the stakes turned up. They hovered over tiny aristocrats who were expected to become orators, senators, or at least socially acceptable banquet guests. The pedagogus acted as the human pressure valve, ensuring childhood chaos did not spill into the streets. One can imagine the quiet absurdity of it. A brilliant Greek intellectual forced to remind a 7-year-old Roman boy to stop stabbing his wax tablet with a stylus out of boredom. Life in antiquity loved irony. From the realm of education, we drift to the scribes, the notarii, the secretarii, and the copyists. Romans were paperwork enthusiasts long before medieval monks made it fashionable. Legal contracts, household accounts, letters, speeches, inventories, testaments, loan records, lists of amphora contents. If you could write it, a Roman elite probably wanted it written. We imagine Rome as marble and valor. In reality, it was scrolls and ink, and someone had to copy those scrolls by hand, slowly, with concentration, and without spelling errors, because parchment did not come with a delete key. Many of these scribes worked in the darker interior rooms of houses, small courtyards, storage spaces, side offices. Noise was limited, mistakes punished, and while the work did not break bones, it consumed time and eyesight. Slaves in these roles often developed the posture of people who spent decades leaning forward, which they did.
From the scribes, we float to the financial managers, the dispensatores, the household accountants. In large homes, these slaves handled money, tracked payments, paid suppliers, collected rents from tenants on family-owned properties. A wealthy Roman could theoretically manage his own finances, but why do that when one could outsource the entire process to an enslaved workforce? Slavery allowed elites to treat management as a leisure hobby instead of a necessity. In many cases, these financial slaves were more literate than their owners, more numerate, better at long-term planning, and fully aware that they would never enjoy the wealth they administered. They could count coins all day without ever truly possessing them. A calm and somewhat depressing metaphor for the Roman social order as a whole.
Now we drift into the medical sphere, where a different subset of slaves operated as nurses, physicians, masseurs, and general health workers. Roman medicine was a blend of actual anatomical knowledge, folk ritual, and wishful thinking. Slave physicians learned by apprenticeship, sometimes from Greek medical texts, sometimes from experience, sometimes from unfortunate trial and error. They supervised diets, applied bandages, mixed herbal remedies, performed cauterizations, and tried to prevent their household from dying prematurely in a world where infection was enthusiastic. Elite Romans occasionally bragged about owning highly skilled medical slaves as if they were living status symbols, similar to rare books or imported art. Because nothing says refinement like telling your dinner guests that your personal doctor was forcibly acquired from a Greek city renowned for medicine. From medicine, we drift to one of the more overlooked roles, the bellari, the bath attendants. Bathing in Rome was a social activity as much as a hygienic one. Slaves prepared oils, managed towels, scraped skin with strigils, and generally facilitated the process of wealthy people transforming bathing into a slow, ritualized performance. At home, this meant filling basins, heating water, maintaining small private baths for families who could afford them. Public baths employed large numbers of slave workers too, but here, in the domestic setting, we focus on the private sphere, where the goal was comfort, status, and not freezing in the winter. Romans did not bathe alone if they could avoid it. Why clean yourself when another human could stand beside you and do it efficiently? Convenience was a major theme of slavery. The household also included entertainment because free Romans disliked complete silence. There were tibicines, flute players. There were singers. There were storytellers. Some were children with good voices. Some were adults with better training. All contributed to the ambiance of elite leisure. They performed during meals, during gatherings, during private evenings. Their job was to fill space and time so that the masters did not sit staring into the void of their own thoughts unaccompanied. Petty luxury required orchestration. Slavery provided it. Now let's float briefly into the category of informational slaves, the messengers, couriers, and heralds. They carried verbal messages across the city. They delivered written notes. They reminded clients of obligations. They coordinated social calendars before digital calendars existed. A Roman elite with many social ties needed logistical support. A Roman slave with fast legs and a good memory fulfilled that need. These slaves spent much of their day navigating city streets, walking, waiting, carrying messages that said things like, "My master will attend your dinner, provided he is not indisposed," which translated roughly to, "Barring a better offer, we will be there." It's a small reminder that Roman society functioned on invitations, obligations, and hierarchies, and an invisible fleet of enslaved labor carried those obligations from house to house in real time. And now we glide toward the slaves who maintained household storage, the salari, the pantry supervisors. Their job was to monitor grain, olive oil, wine, dried fruits, pickled vegetables, salted fish, cheeses, honey, and anything else that preserved reasonably well in clay jars under Mediterranean conditions. Food was seasonal, supply chains irregular. Nothing could be allowed to spoil. These slaves tracked inventory long before spreadsheets existed. Every amphora was counted, every portion allocated, every missing measure accounted for. Where modern refrigerators offer convenience, Roman storage offered anxiety. One miscalculation could ruin a winter, which meant the cellar slave lived in mild, ongoing tension while their masters debated philosophy upstairs. It's a quiet pattern in Roman life. Someone worried, so someone else didn't have to. And that brings us to the last household space for tonight, the linen rooms, overseen often by women slaves responsible for weaving, repairing, and cataloging fabrics. Clothing in ancient Rome was time-consuming to produce and expensive to replace. Most households reused fabric until it dissolved into rags, which themselves were reused for yet more humble purposes. Linen rooms were not elegant. They contained baskets, thread, needles, warp-weighted looms, and people who sat for hours weaving because textiles did not produce themselves. Children often learned the work early. little hands, endless repetition, a lifetime of threads.
Dim the lights. Relax your shoulders. We're diving deeper into the subtle psychology of slavery in Rome. Because daily tasks are one thing, but the mental world behind those tasks is another. Roman society normalized slavery with such thoroughness that most free Romans barely questioned it. It was the default setting, like air or taxes. Slaves were property, yes, but also part of the social fabric. And the longer you lived in that system, the more natural it seemed. For the enslaved, the mental landscape was shaped by constant hierarchy, uncertainty, and control. Slaves rarely had privacy. Their bodies, their words, their movements, their thoughts, sometimes even their names were owned by someone else. Names were an interesting issue. Many slaves lost their birth names. They were given new ones, sometimes simple labels, sometimes ironic nicknames, sometimes names referencing places of origin or physical traits. A Greek slave might be called Gracchus. A black slave might be called Niger. An unusually tall slave might be Longus. The name was a small reminder of ownership and identity reduction. Owners often preferred slaves with pleasant demeanors because an obedient slave was less trouble. Sometimes kindness from the master was extended, but rarely without purpose. It was a tool of control, rewards for compliance, punishments for resistance. Roman writers sometimes advised masters to treat slaves well, not out of empathy, but because it was more efficient. A well-fed, well-treated slave worked better than a hungry, abused one. The advice was pragmatic, not moral. Ancient philosophy rarely focused on slave liberation. More often, it rationalized the system. For the slaves, this meant living in a constant state of negotiation. Every day involved reading moods, predicting reactions, balancing submission with survival. Resistance existed, but it was subtle, hidden, expressed in small acts, like working slowly, breaking tools, or slight disobedience. Open rebellion was rare and dangerous. Some slaves formed communities, shared stories, shared food, developed networks of mutual support. Religion sometimes played a role. Household gods, mystery cults. Early Christianity later provided spiritual solace for some slaves, but for most, survival depended on practical relationships. Interestingly, some slaves gained informal power inside households, those who managed accounts, those who acted as intermediaries between masters and other slaves. Sometimes, the villicus, or estate manager, was a trusted figure who balanced authority with empathy. Though still enslaved, they held a unique social position. Freedom was possible, but rare. Manumission happened mostly through wills or purchase. Freed slaves often remained connected to their former masters as clients. A complex web of obligation and dependence replaced outright ownership. Slavery in Rome was not static. It was a social system with gradations. The psychological impact varied. Some slaves internalized their status. Some resisted internally. Some found small joys and moments of agency. Others lived lives of quiet despair. For the masters, slaves were part of a world that was orderly, predictable, and manageable. They represented labor, status, and even companionship in some cases. Yet, the mental burden of owning other humans was rarely discussed. It was simply accepted. The movies and popular stories often dramatize slavery with heroic escapes, brutal whips, and cinematic violence. Real Roman slavery was often quieter, a slow drip of labor, endless repetition, constant negotiation, and a system maintained not by passion, but by habit. Tonight, we remember that the daily lives of slaves were not shaped by dramatic moments.
They were shaped by hours of waiting, of serving, of doing without complaint, because complaint meant punishment or worse. And so we drift gently toward the end of this part. Tomorrow, we will explore the rare moments when slaves could exert influence or reshape their lives, when the empire's machinery showed cracks, and when individual lives, against all odds, found ways to push back. Until then, rest in the slow calm of history. The world keeps turning, slaves keep working, and time flows onward, quietly, endlessly.